powerful man in antiquity has just bowed his head to a total stranger. The smoke from the first great war of the ancient world was still choking the valley of Siddim. Abraham had crushed 4 ruthless armies, taken back his family, secured the region's trade routes, and cemented himself as the invincible patriarch. He was the undisputed master of that battlefield. Yet, on his march home, his armed procession is intercepted by a lone man descending from a city called Salem. What happens in the next few minutes defies all logic of power. The towering father of faith bows down and hands over 10% of his spoils of war to this stranger, a man who, brutally shattering the record-keeping customs of the time, possesses no genealogy. He has no registered father, mother, or tribe. It is a staggering glitch in the system of the ancient Bible. A phantom warrior priest who emerged from the shadows, subdued the most important leader in Hebrew history, and vanished as quickly as he appeared, burying a millennia-old enigma in the sands of time. To grasp the sheer weight of this mysterious encounter, we need to travel back mentally to the unforgiving culture of the ancient Middle East. Back then, and if you're used to studying the scriptures, you know this all too well, your lineage was practically everything you had. Your last name, your tribe, the meticulous record of your ancestors that formed your true identity. It was your passport to exist in society. If your name wasn't properly etched into the genealogical scrolls, you were simply a nobody. You had no right to own land, no voice at the city gates, and under no circumstances could you even dream of taking on a leadership role, much less the sacred and highly restricted office of a priest. Blood dictated the rules of the game, and there was no room for exceptions. That is exactly why the book of Genesis is almost obsessive, methodically rigorous, in listing who fathered whom. Generation after generation, the sacred text makes a point to tie every character to their family tree. It is a flawless web of ancestors and heirs, built to prove the legitimacy of every leader who walked that land. But then we hit chapter 14 of Genesis. And here, my friends, the biblical text suffers a brutal and entirely intentional fracture. It is as if the gears of history stopped turning for a second. Right in the middle of a violent narrative about monarchs, war alliances, and hostage rescues, the figure of Melchizedek appears out of nowhere. He steps onto the scene not as a defeated king or a soldier begging for mercy, but as a true titan, only without presenting any birth certificate. It is a glaring historical anomaly. A man of flesh and blood operating in a spiritual and political jurisdiction of the highest order, a system of power that hadn't even been mapped out for humanity yet. With no documented father, no registered mother, no beginning of days or end of life recorded in the ancient scrolls. He simply is. What we are going to do today is not just retell a familiar story, but conduct a true forensic investigation into the man I consider the perfect anachronism of the Scriptures. Together, we will decode the complex geopolitics that surrounded the King's Valley and deeply understand this clash of hierarchies that forced the mighty patriarch Abraham to lower his weapons and bow down. More than that, we will look at the strong evidence that the most powerful, just, and spiritually balanced government in all of antiquity was already functioning silently and perfectly in Jerusalem. Yes, long before the Hebrew people even dreamed of conquering the walls of that holy city, there was already a guardian laying down the rules of the Most High on earth. Before we dive into this time machine to unravel the gears of this enigma, I ask that you go ahead and leave a like on this video and make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any of our in-depth studies. Also, take a moment to hit the comments and type a loud Amen, or if you prefer, write down your favorite prayer. This really helps our work reach more people who, just like you, love the historical truth behind the Bible. Make yourself comfortable, because the curtain of time is about to open. To understand the crushing weight of this meeting and the true anomaly that Melchizedek represents, we need to take a step back and look at the rules of the game in the biblical world. Those of you who have some life experience and understand how human nature works know an inconvenient truth very well. Power intoxicates, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. When the nation of Israel was finally formed by God, centuries after Abraham, the Creator laid down an ironclad rule, a truly unbreakable taboo for the governance of His people. The throne and the altar could never, under any circumstances, mix. The sword of justice and the smoke of intercession strictly had to remain in different hands. It was a system of checks and balances engineered by heaven itself. The political crown would belong to the tribe of Judah, and the religious censor would be restricted to the tribe of Levi. The king could not offer sacred sacrifices, and the priest could not sit on the throne to dictate war tactics. This radical divide existed to protect the people themselves from human tyranny. When a man tries to own the body and soul of a nation, he inevitably puts himself in the place of the Creator. And biblical history shows us in agonizing detail what happened when someone tried to cross that red line. Think of the tragic King Saul, the first monarch of Israel, surrounded by his Philistine enemies, watching his army shrink in fear and sweating bullets under the pressure of war. He refused to wait for the time set by the prophet Samuel. In an act of pure arrogance mixed with the desperation of someone who doesn't want to lose control, Saul took on the priestly role himself and offered the burnt offering. God's response was immediate and devastating. The dynasty was ripped from his hands forever. Or, let's remember the formidable King Uzziah. The guy was an administrative phenomenon, a true military genius who modernized the army, built up defenses, and made the country incredibly wealthy. But success went to his head in a terrifying way. Blinded by pride, he thought his flawless resume gave him a free pass to march into the temple and burn incense on the altar, a duty exclusive to the priests. Even after being warned by 80 brave leaders who blocked his path, he stood his ground. The result? Leprosy instantly broke out on his forehead right then and there, inside the holy place. The invincible king ended his days exiled sick and isolated from everyone. The divine message was always crystal clear. The politician who tries to hijack the sacred office signs his own ruin. But then, my friends, we rewind the tape of time and return to that dusty valley where Abraham has just wiped the blood off his sword after the First World War of antiquity. The patriarch stands before a man who is the embodiment of a historical short circuit. Melchizedek emerges from the carnage, walking with the unquestionable posture of an absolute monarch, yet bearing the reverence of a spiritual intercessor. The text of the book of Genesis doesn't stutter or back down when recording his two simultaneous offices. First, he is recognized as the King of Salem. And here, etymology gives us a flood of meaning. The very name Melchizedek means King of Righteousness, while Salem is the ancient root of the word shalom, which we translate as peace. Therefore, he is the King of Righteousness and the King of Peace. But right after, in the exact same breath, the text fires off his second credential. He is the priest of God Most High, El Elyon. How is this possible? How does this mysterious man manage to do what, centuries later, would cost Saul his sanity and Uzziah his skin? How does he hold, at the same time, the golden crown on his head and the priestly garments without being instantly incinerated by the Creator's judgment? This is exactly where our investigation gains depth. Melchizedek wasn't bending the rules or disrespecting God's laws. Quite the opposite. He operated in a jurisdiction so high, at a level of authority so stratospheric, that the containment laws created to limit flawed humanity simply did not apply to him. He vibrated on a frequency that the system was not equipped to handle. By presenting himself to Abraham in this dual and flawless manner, he was proving that the perfect model of government, the unbreakable union between the authority that judges and the love that redeems, already existed and was fully operational, just not in the hands of ego-driven men. Melchizedek unified these two powers with a purity that no king or priest of the Hebrew nation would ever manage to replicate. He was a living paradox, a ruler who did not use politics to oppress the masses and did not use religion to manipulate hearts. Looking at that man, Abraham, the great general and hero of the day, instantly realized he was facing a governmental and spiritual order that crushed any military force and made a mockery of any human tradition. To feel the real impact of this meeting, we need to tear up that romanticized Sunday school picture. The scene there was not a peaceful Sunday morning service. It was the brutal aftermath of a slaughter. The Valley of Shaveh, also known as the King's Valley, reeked of ancient sweat, blood, and dust. Abraham and his 318 brave men were exhausted, surrounded by mountains of war spoils, rescued prisoners, and captured weapons. And it is in this climate of sheer military tension, with nerves on edge, that the geopolitical chess game begins. The king of Sodom, a cunning and corrupt man, was also there. He shows up amidst the makeshift trenches, trying to negotiate with Abraham, trying to buy the patriarch's loyalty with the loot that had been recovered. It was old-school human politics in action. Money trying to overpower morality, corruption trying to embrace virtue. But suddenly, the atmosphere of the valley changes drastically. It's as if the wind just stopped blowing. Walking down toward the camp, oblivious to all that petty squabbling for power and wealth, comes Melchizedek. The mental camera we use to visualize this scene shows us an absolutely shocking contrast. On one side, you have the wicked king of Sodom sweating bullets, desperate to regain his political clout, trying to haggle with gold and slaves. On the other side enters the monarch of Salem. He brings no war chariots, he is not escorted by fierce spearmen, and he demands no formal surrender. What he carries in his hands completely defies the logic of that bloodbath. He brings only bread and wine. Pay very close attention to this surgical detail, because this is the first time in all of history and the entire biblical text that these two elements appear together. Long before the tables of the Jewish Passover in Egypt, Long before the Last Supper, bread and wine show up in the middle of a torn-up battlefield. Bread, which restores the strength of a body battered by war, and wine, which gladdens the soul and symbolizes the covenant of life. Melchizedek does not act like a vulture wanting his cut of the profit. Instead of demanding, he offers. Instead of collecting taxes, he ministers. The monarch of Salem raises his voice in the middle of that valley and declares a thunderous blessing. Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And it is in this exact second that the climax of our story begins to take shape, shattering the paradigms of everyone standing there. With just a few words, Melchizedek silences the loudmouth king of Sodom and disarms all the aggression of that exhausted battalion. He establishes immediate, absolute, and undeniable spiritual and territorial dominance. He didn't have to draw a single sword to prove who was in charge. Abraham, the man who had just trampled the most feared nations of that century, looks at that bread, looks at that wine, and realizes right then and there that his military victories meant absolutely nothing compared to the majesty of that priesthood. The conqueror of the ancient world was subdued not by a spear to his neck, but by a table prepared in the presence of his enemies. Knowing how to place these mind-blowing events on the exact timeline makes all the difference for anyone who wants to have a sharp mind for the Scriptures. Understanding what came before, what came after, and how the Creator orchestrated every detail completely changes our worldview. And if you like to study like this, in an organized, logical, and deep way, I have a special recommendation. Take a quick pause at the end of this video and check out our ebook, The Bible in Chronological Order, from Genesis to Revelation. The link to grab this fantastic resource is pinned in the first comment right down below. It's a must-have tool for anyone who is tired of getting lost in the time jumps of the sacred text and wants to see history with cinematic clarity. We have now reached the peak of our climax, the exact moment when the mind of any Scripture scholar has to stop and recalculate the route. To the casual reader, Abraham's attitude might just seem like a nice gesture of religious gratitude. After all, he sets aside 10% of everything and places it in the hands of that mysterious priest. But, my friends, we need to rip away the veil of superficial religion to understand the raw math of the ancient world. In the geopolitics of that era, handing over a tithe of the spoils of war was, under no circumstances, an act of charity or a little voluntary offering. Paying 10% of the wealth captured on the battlefield was the blood signature on a treaty of vassalage. It was a public, military, and political declaration that you recognized the receiver as your suzerain, your absolute superior. You only paid tribute to someone who was way above you on the food chain of power. For you to feel the absurd weight of this scene, we need to look at what Abraham had just done minutes before in that same valley, talking to the king of Sodom. The Sodomite monarch tried to make a gentleman's agreement with the patriarch. Give me the people back and keep all the wealth for yourself. It was an incalculable fortune, my friends. Enough money to buy entire cities and build an empire. But what was Abraham's reaction? He stood his ground and refused every single penny. He stated loud and clear that he wouldn't accept a single thread or the strap of a sandal from that wicked king. The reason? Abraham was terrified of owing favors to corrupt politicians. He didn't want the king of Sodom running his mouth in the town squares later on, claiming he was the one who made Abraham rich. The patriarch was the lone wolf of faith, the man who answered solely and exclusively to the God who called him out of Ur of the Chaldeans. He was unyielding and bulletproof in his independence. Yet, the master stroke of the narrative happens right there. This same Abraham, with his unshakable hardcore stance, who wouldn't even take a shoelace from the corrupt system, turns to Melchizedek and, of his own free will, opens his war chests. He separates the elite 10%, the absolute cream of the crop of the spoils, and places it into the hands of that man with no past. Understand this, he was not coerced, he was not threatened by a larger army, and he wasn't paying a toll to pass through the lands of Salem. Abraham did this because his spiritual eyes were opened in an overwhelming way. He saw in Melchizedek a rank so incalculably higher than his own that the only logical response for that giant of faith was to bend his back and, with deep reverence, take the position of a subordinate. If you think this interpretation is just a modern theory meant to hype up the story, I invite you to examine the documentary evidence left in the book of Hebrews, deep in the New Testament. Centuries later, the author of this letter performs a true forensic autopsy on this encounter in the King's Valley and shines a blinding light on the case. He sets down a universal, unquestionable rule of antiquity. Without any doubt, the lesser is blessed by the greater. Divine math is exact and does not fail. Melchizedek raised his hand and blessed. Abraham bowed his head and received. Melchizedek opened his hands and accepted the royal tribute. Abraham opened the chests and paid the vassal tax. The sacred text makes a point of humbling human arrogance and putting the pieces right where they belong. The man who held the promise of being the father of multitudes, the man who carried the seed of the Messiah himself in his chest, was undeniably the lesser in that conversation. This really messes with our heads and forces us to stare into the abyss of this mystery. Think with me, using all the life experience and wisdom you've gathered up to today. Abraham is the ultimate figure, the undisputed heavyweight of monotheistic history. 3 of the largest religions in the world today still fight for the right to call him Father. He is the pillar, the root, the trunk of the tree of faith. But in the cutting silence of that blood-stained valley, the Father of all faith looks at a guy with no birth certificate, no lineage, no mother, and no tribe, and practically calls him Lord. The chronological and logical hierarchy of humanity collapses right there, crumbling to the ground. If the most spectacular, wealthy, and powerful man in the biblical world drops to his knees and hands over his riches, we are left with the haunting question that echoes through eternity. After all, who is the man that the very Father of faith obeys? Just how massive was the shadow of this Melchizedek, capable of swallowing up and outshining the light of the invincible patriarch? Now that the dust of battle has settled and the adrenaline of our climax has dropped, it is time to put on our detective gloves. The logical mind demands answers. Ultimately, who was the flesh and blood man behind that priestly mantle? If we dig into the oldest and most respected archives of humanity, like the ancient Jewish Targums, which are the Aramaic translations and commentaries of the Old Testament, and the mysterious Dead Sea Scrolls found in the caves of Qumran, we will run into a fascinating and historically very robust theory. To the wise men of that time, Melchizedek was not a folkloric figure or a ghost. They saw a quite familiar face in him. Ancient rabbinic tradition slams the gavel down, claiming that this king-priest was, in fact, Shem, the surviving son of Noah. I know that at first glance this might sound like chronological madness to the modern mind. How could Noah's son be alive to share a glass of wine with Abraham? But when you run the numbers on the rigorous timeline of the book of Genesis, the math lines up in a scary way. Because of the almost unimaginable lifespans of the pre-flood patriarchs, the timelines overlapped in a staggering manner. Shem lived an astonishing 600 years. He didn't just outlive several generations of his own descendants, he was Abraham's contemporary. To tell the raw, unfiltered truth pointed out by the records, Shem actually outlived Abraham. Try to visualize the magnitude of that scene. On one side, our patriarch Abraham, the new pioneer of faith, the man paving the way to the future. On the other, Shem, the supreme elder, the living relic of the world before the flood, the great guardian of original monotheism, who watched the world drown and be reborn. Through this lens, it makes total practical and cultural sense that Abraham, respecting the strict patriarchal hierarchy of the Middle East, would bow down, acknowledge authority, and pay tithes to his highest-ranking ancestor. However, there is a sharp stone in this investigative shoe. If it really was old Shem, why did the author of Genesis hide his historical name and call him only by the title of Melchizedek? And, even worse, how do we deal with the forensic analysis in the book of Hebrews, which states loud and clear that he had no father, no mother, and no genealogy? Come on, Shem had a wildly famous father named Noah, and his family tree is one of the most detailed in the Bible. This documentary fracture forces us to open the second file in our investigation, a thesis widely debated in the halls of deep theology, the theophany, or more specifically, a Christophany. For a massive branch of scholars and historical thinkers of the early church, Melchizedek was not a mere mortal stretched out by time. He would be a physical, temporary appearance of God himself, the pre-incarnate Christ, stepping onto the dust of the earth to establish order, even before the law of Moses was drafted in the desert. Think about the terrifying weight of this hypothesis. He comes out of nowhere in the middle of a war, bringing bread and wine, the exact signature of the new covenant that would be made millennia later at Calvary. He receives the tithes not like an old grandpa getting a gift, but as the deity collecting his rightful tribute. He blesses the patriarch with an authority that is not of this world, and right after, he disappears from the pages of history without leaving behind a ruined palace or a tomb to be venerated. Being a tangible divine manifestation, it is obvious he doesn't possess biological parents in the earthly registry, has no beginning of days, and much less an end of life. He is the very essence of the eternal priesthood, an office that is not inherited from a sick man and is not passed down to a successor. But regardless of which of these documents you consider the strongest for your own understanding, whether it's the historical thesis of Noah's son or the grand theological vision of a divine appearance, the real trick of this narrative lies exactly in what the sacred text chose to hide. Melchizedek's lack of a past wasn't an editing mistake or a slip of the mind by the author of Genesis. It was a meticulously designed omission, a masterstroke by the Spirit of God. By erasing this man's birth certificate and family ties, the biblical text brilliantly forces us to look away from his DNA, his blood, or his social class, and focus 100% on his function. The message carved between these ancient lines is a heavy blow to the corrupt system of men. True spiritual authority, righteous government, and the priesthood that actually reaches God's heart do not depend on your biology. Melchizedek's missing past was recorded to prove that the highest offices in the universe are not hereditary, cannot be bought or handed down for convenience, but are appointed solely and exclusively from the throne room of the Most High. When we stop to coldly analyze the structure of the book of Genesis, we stumble upon a detail that is, to say the least, unnerving. Melchizedek takes up exactly 3 verses in the entire narrative of that patriarchal period. That's just 3 short sentences wedged into the dust of a war. But the shadow this man cast over the history of faith is so colossal that it outshines, in one fell swoop, all the thousands of high priests, Levites, and teachers of the law who came after him. He didn't need entire books dedicated to his rules. He didn't need a gold-plated temple. He didn't wear breastplates covered in precious stones. Nor did he rely on an Ark of the Covenant to validate his direct contact with the sacred. He cemented himself as the living, textual, and archaeological proof that the Creator's sovereign control over the destiny of humanity was never handcuffed. It was never trapped or held hostage by a single family, a single strand of DNA, or a set of ordinances that wouldn't even be handed down until centuries later. In the harsh sands of the Sinai desert, this priest with no past, this king with no apparent heirs, forced his way into the annals of humanity with a surgical and definitive purpose. He needed to prove once and for all, right at the dawn of the chosen people's creation, that a man's bloodline is not and will never be the factor that defines absolute authority before heaven. We know all too well how the religious and political bureaucracy of men works. The world demands stamps, resumes, heavyweight last names, and exhausting rituals of acceptance. But God Most High does not and has never operated under the pressure of these earthly chains. Melchizedek stepped onto that bloody battlefield not just to feed exhausted soldiers, but to unmask human arrogance. He came to prove that true power walks inevitably hand in hand with justice and peace, a lesson that the corrupt king of Sodom could never understand with all his dirty gold, and that even our formidable Abraham had to learn in the most profound and humbling way possible, by opening his treasures and bending his back. And so, with the same staggering and silent naturalness with which he appeared, he bowed out of the narrative. When the enigmatic King of Salem turned his back, blessed the patriarch, and walked calmly back behind the walls of his city, he took with him the great secret of a perfect order of government, an unbreakable gear. He didn't found a human dynasty. He left no named successors. He didn't open a school for prophets, nor did he carve his face into stone monuments to be remembered. What he left behind was immensely more powerful. He left Abraham and the rest of the entire ancient world with a certainty that echoes down to our days, the unshakable certainty that the true command center of planet Earth wasn't waiting for the nations to organize themselves before it could act. The untouchable throne of the Most High was already operating silently and fully, ruling with a firm hand and ministering life through bread and wine long before the nation of Israel was born and long before any mortal dreamed of putting a crown on their head. The story of Melchizedek is the ultimate reminder that God's power has no beginning, has no end, and needs absolutely no human approval.